Empires are remembered for their greatness, their power, their victories, their legacy. But that's only half the story. Because behind every empire, there's something darker. Stories that were buried, voices that were silenced, truths that never made it into the history books. What if everything you learned about empires was only what they wanted you to know? Because the rise of power always comes at a cost. And the deeper you look, the harder it becomes to ignore what was left out. Empires were not built overnight. They rose slowly, through conquest, strategy, and control. From the outside, they appeared unstoppable, organized, powerful, almost invincible. But beneath that image was something far more complex. Every expansion came with a cost. Lands were taken. People were displaced. Entire communities were forced to adapt, or disappear. What was recorded as victory often meant loss for countless others whose stories were never written down. History tends to focus on the rulers, the kings, generals, and leaders who shaped these vast empires. Their achievements are documented, studied, and remembered. But the experiences of ordinary people, those were rarely preserved. Farmers, workers, and families lived through the consequences of empire building. They faced new laws, new rulers, and new systems that controlled every part of their lives. For many, survival meant obedience, and resistance came at a risk. Because empires didn't just expand, they maintained control through authority and, at times, fear. Order had to be enforced. Stability had to be protected. From a distance, it looked like progress. Roads were built. Cities expanded. Trade increased. But those developments often came from heavy labor, strict systems, and sacrifices that were never fully acknowledged. This is the side of empire that history doesn't always show. Not the glory, but the cost behind it. Because every empire tells a story of success. But only if you ignore the voices that were never given a chance to speak. Empires didn't survive on strength alone. They survived on control. As territories expanded, rulers faced a growing challenge. How do you manage vast lands filled with different cultures, languages, and beliefs? The answer wasn't always unity. Often, it was control. New laws were introduced. Systems were built to monitor populations, collect resources, and maintain order. Authority wasn't just present, it was constant. From local officials to distant rulers, the structure of power reached into everyday life. People were expected to adapt quickly. Traditions changed. Customs shifted. And in many cases, identity itself began to fade under the weight of a larger empire. For some, this brought opportunity. Trade routes expanded. Cities grew. New connections formed. But for many others, it meant something very different. It meant living under rules they didn't choose. Speaking languages that weren't their own. Following systems that didn't reflect their way of life. And when people resisted, the response was rarely gentle. Empires couldn't afford instability. Rebellion, even in small forms, was seen as a threat to the entire structure. So control had to be reinforced, sometimes quietly, sometimes forcefully. Over time, this created a delicate balance. Order on the surface, pressure underneath. Because the larger an empire became, the harder it was to hold everything together, and the more effort it took to keep control from slipping away. From the outside, it looked like unity, but inside, it was a constant struggle to maintain power. When we think about empires, we remember names, rulers, generals, conquerors. But empires weren't built by a few powerful individuals alone. They were built by countless people whose names were never recorded. Workers who constructed roads, walls, and cities. Farmers who produced food to sustain growing populations. Laborers who carried out the physical demands of expansion. Their efforts made empires possible, but their stories rarely made it into history. Life for these individuals was not defined by glory. It was defined by survival. Long days of work. Limited choices. Systems that controlled how they lived, what they produced, and what they owed. For many, their role in the empire was not a choice, it was an expectation. And yet, their experiences were often invisible. History tends to focus on outcomes: who won, who ruled, who expanded. But it rarely captures what it felt like to live under those outcomes. The struggles, the adjustments, the quiet endurance of everyday life within a powerful system. Some communities adapted. Others resisted in small, unnoticed ways. Holding onto traditions, preserving identity, finding ways to survive within structures that were never designed for them. But these acts didn't always leave a record. And over time, they faded. What remains is a version of history shaped by those in power. A version that highlights achievement, while leaving out the people who made it possible. Because empires didn't just create history. They decided what part of it would be remembered, and what would be forgotten. From a distance, empires looked unbreakable. Strong borders, powerful armies, expanding influence. But beneath that image, there were cracks. The larger an empire grew, the harder it became to maintain stability. Different regions had different needs, different cultures, different expectations. Holding everything together required constant effort, and even then, it was never guaranteed. Tension didn't always appear as open conflict. Sometimes it was quiet, a growing dissatisfaction, a slow resistance. Small acts that didn't seem significant on their own, but over time, began to add up. Communication across vast distances was slow. Decisions made at the center didn't always match realities on the edges. Local problems could grow before anyone in power even realized they existed. And when pressure built, had to go somewhere. Economic strain, shifting loyalties, internal disagreements, these were the forces that weakened empires from within. Not always visible, not always immediate, but always present. What looked like strength on the outside often required constant maintenance behind the scenes. Resources had to be managed. Authority had to be reinforced. Order had to be preserved. And the more effort it took to hold everything together, the more fragile it became. Because an empire doesn't collapse all at once. It weakens gradually, piece by piece, until one day, the structure that once seemed permanent no longer holds. When empires fall, history remembers the moment. The final battle. The turning point. The end. But what often gets left out is everything that came before it. The slow changes. The hidden struggles. The experiences of people who lived through the rise and the decline without ever being part of the official story. History is often written from a distance. It focuses on outcomes, not processes. On leaders, not lives. And in doing so, it simplifies something that was never simple. The truth is, empires were not just systems of power. They were lived experiences. For every road that was built, someone labored. For every law that was enforced, someone adapted or resisted. For every expansion recorded as victory, there were countless untold stories on the other side. These aren't the kinds of details that always make it into textbooks. Not because they don't matter, but because they're harder to capture, harder to summarize. But they're essential to understanding the full picture. Because without them, history becomes incomplete. Not false, but unfinished. The dark side of empires isn't always hidden. Sometimes, it's simply overlooked. And once you start to see it, you realize that every empire has two stories.